tuned in to Women in America, the podcast that dives deep into the issues shaping gender equality in the U.S. and beyond. Hosted by Pari and Eve, public health professionals by day, content creators by passion, we bring you expert insights, compelling stories, and actionable strategies to push the fight for equality forward. In our first few episodes, we're talking about rights at a crossroads, unpacking the intersections of reproductive rights and gender justice in today's America. In today's episode, we're untangling the complex history and devastating legal fallout of the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe v. Wade. What does the post-Dobbs legal landscape look like? How have states weaponized the courts to create a patchwork of abortion access, or lack thereof? And what's at stake as cases continue to fight their way through the system? Let's dive in.
Episode 2, let's go.
Before we get into the real good stuff, I think you texted me that you were having kind of a hard weekend because you spent a lot of it in the vet.
Yeah, Arlo, for those listening, is my bunny. And he, poor little babe, has had a recurring eye infection, which for literal years, the vet thought was because he has his teeth growing in like the wrong angle. And so it affects like the nerves in his eye, you know, just like us and how our sinuses are all connected. Theirs are too. And then now, 6.5 years into his life and his vet care, she was like, actually, this might just be an allergic reaction. And I'm like,
oh my gosh.
So they put him on steroids and it's made a huge difference, even in just like 24 or 48 hours. We still did like a bacterial culture and a whole bunch of tests that we're waiting on results for. But I now have to basically do like an elimination situation where I'm like, okay, if I change the detergent that I wash like his pillows in, and like maybe I change the cleaning agent I use for his cage. But I think the part of my brain is like, how is it possible that this is all of a sudden an allergic reaction and not something more, because we've been treating it for years thinking it was a congenital issue. But anyway, yeah, he's doing much better. So
I have to say, I did not know anything about pet bun buns until I met your first pet rabbit, because Arlo's your second one, right?
Yeah, Aristotle was my first one.
Aristotle. He was such a fine gentleman, but I had no idea how long bunnies lived. I didn't know about all their teeth care. I didn't know how they acted, because he like hoppity hops around your house and sometimes will like get stuck buffering in a corner just staring at the wall, like totally normal.
Yeah, I mean, I guess just like humans, he has days where he's just like, what is life even? But yeah, he's free roam. He chills, hangs out. He's lovely. But yeah, it is kind of funny, just like all of his health access stuff.
He has more access than we do sometimes. I feel like it's easier for you to get him into the vet than it is for me to make a doctor's appointment.
That might be true. That reminds me of when the state of New York, they announced that they were going to spend public dollars to neuter all of the rats.
Yes.
And there were all of those memes about how like even the rats are getting better reproductive health care.
Free rat contraception, and here I am, can't figure out how to get my IUD replaced. I had to call around to like 5 doctors, but the rats just immediately, although involuntarily.
They probably have pain management too, actually.
I would die if that was the case. Thinking back to my own IUD experience. Horrible. Horrible.
Yeah. Oh man, the irony of this is so good.
Pet medicine, I theorize, is probably better than human medicine because, first of all, they don't have court systems involved in their healthcare decisions.
True. What a concept.
What would a pet Supreme Court be?
I don't know. I'm just trying to think of like who the SCOTUS judges would be, like Clifford the Red Dog.
I'm thinking of like, I don't know if you know the movie Madagascar, but like a Madagascar-style tribunal.
Yeah, of course. Although I would not trust King Julian with my reproductive.
No, he is literally Trump.
Yeah, he's a wacko. The irony is that for the first century of America's existence, abortion was totally not controversial. You know, it was just like a fact of life. It was a part of people's healthcare. It has existed, as we know.
Well, it wasn't politically controversial, but it was restricted, wasn't it?
Not in the first century of America's existence. So it
Oh,
wasn't
of our
restricted.
existence. Okay.
Yeah, it wasn't restricted until like the mid 19th century. And actually, I'm glad you brought that up because I don't think people realize this, but basically, okay, so before the mid 19th century, the American attitude towards abortion was basically just like it was a quiet legal reality. So people didn't really question it. It wasn't something that was talked about. It was just like, yeah, this is just part and parcel of what people with uteruses experience. And then there was a shift, and it's not because of the reasons we might expect. The first anti-abortion movement in the US was not driven because of moral or religious concerns. It was driven by physicians, which is like the opposite of what you would think, right? But basically, what happened was that the American Medical Association was established. Okay, so we are putting ourselves in 1847 at this point, so mid 19th century, and the AMA is established, which, of course, at the time refused to include any female physicians or people of color. So think about a group of white male physicians who are trying to legitimize themselves as the leading doctor group, right?
Mm-hmm.
And previous to this time, all of the abortion work that was happening in the US was happening by what we would today call midwives.
Mm-hmm.
And the midwives were all women. And so
that's a stark contrast to begin with, that the
right.
AMA is like all white men and the actual on the ground providers are women.
So, but the thing is, if people could see me, I would be using quotation marks, right? Around physicians, people who had gone to med school did not see these midwives as legitimate providers. But they were the ones who had been providing abortions through, at the time, like abortifacient plants or like methods that had been passed down through generations.
Can you explain the word abortifacient? Because I feel like it's coming into like our, here I'm going to use another big word, lexicon. It's like coming into our regular speech, but abortifacient, I think, one, it sounds really old school. Like it sounds like an 1800s term. And two, it sounds like very clinical. If you don't work in our field, how do you work the word abortifacient into regular?
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a great call out. Okay, so basically, an abortifacient is a product that would induce an abortion or, terminate a pregnancy. So over history, abortifacients were specific plants or like these things called pessaries, which are essentially basically like a tampon-like device that was soaked in a specific plant-based solution to then induce termination. And then, of course, that would lead to what we now call a dilation and curettage, a DNC. Like a person who was wanting an abortion would take an abortifacient, and then the midwives would facilitate a DNC for them.
So an abortifacient is not like a current today's medical term that means like a safe abortion method. It just means something that induces an abortion. At the time, it was being used to describe natural plant substances that would induce an abortion because that's the best that medicine had at the time. But an abortifacient can be used to refer to today's medication abortion.
Yeah, that's right. Abortifacient is essentially a word that is a category. So it includes any product that would start a termination. And in today's world, the two primary abortifacients that are considered standard of care and absolutely safe to use are the two abortion pills, which are misoprostol and mifepristone. But the plants that were historically used still exist, and that's how they would be categorized. So that's what that word means. But back to the male-dominated American Medical Association. Okay, so these dudes basically came on the scene in 1847 and were like, no women, no people of color, and also we are the best. They wanted to be regarded as like the gatekeepers of the medical profession. So what they did is that they essentially launched a full-blown criminalization campaign of people that were not them, aka the people who had been providing abortions. And they did it through classic letter writing campaign. But essentially what they did is like organized medicine takes this anti-abortion position because they want to label themselves as legitimate and everyone else as quacks.
When you say letter writing campaign, it's like the original, my Gen Z babies aren't going to get this, but chain email.
Yeah.
Remember in the early aughts or 90s when you'd get like an email and you have to send it to like 20 different people to get good luck?
Yeah. Or like now, I mean, my South Asian mom will laugh at me if she hears me saying this. Now those are WhatsApp forwards, right? Those are
Oh, yes.
yeah. So basically, the AMA
Yeah.
started a letter writing campaign pushing state lawmakers to ban abortion. And like classic male behavior, right? They're not like, hey, we're going to provide it instead. They're just like, no, we haven't done this historically. We don't have expertise in reproductive health. And this other group is considered the expert. So we're just going to stop doing it altogether. And
Cool.
so all of a sudden, basically within a span of 20 years, from 1860 to 1880, 40 anti-abortion laws suddenly go onto the books for no medical reason other than the fact that these people have an ego and they wanted to be the best regarded physicians. And so it's weird because like you and I, Eve, as academics and public health professionals, now we regard the AMA as a legitimate organization and we rely on their research and things like that. But historically, they were actually the reason why all of this shit started to go down in the first place.
There's a lot of dark histories to a lot of the repro rights organizations that exist today, and like very intentional spacing and kind of like rebranding and renaming, because
For sure.
a lot of reproductive health's history was forced, involuntary, and we've only really been able to change that model in a large scale societal way in the last couple of decades. The AMA piece doesn't surprise me from what you and I know about global reproductive health.
Yeah, but honestly, okay, I should like caveat what I'm saying because I shouldn't shit on all physicians. So essentially what happened was the start of the AMA is the reason why the anti-abortion movement started in the US. But a lot of doctors didn't agree with that approach and mentality. So some doctors continued to perform abortions in the late 19th early 20th century. Like abortion was unfortunately by then illegal in almost all American states and territories. But the Great Depression had entered the US, and doctors were essentially like empathetically understanding why women wouldn't want a child during a time where there was like massive economic recession, people's lifespans were limited, diseases were spreading drastically, and things like that.
So, are you saying that the Great Depression was a good thing for reproductive rights?
I mean, I might need to like really go into a deep rabbit hole before I can say yes or no on that. But I will say that there are some cities, I think now the same cities that are mostly blue, where during the Great Depression, doctors were more willing to perform them off book because of the Great Depression. Unfortunately, then World War II happened, and the leniency that was coming because of the Great Depression completely ended because, this is going to sound familiar to a lot of us, they were really concerned about the American population, right? So they're like,
and people
hold
dying
on.
at war, right?
Yeah, exactly. They're like, wait, we just lost a bunch of people. We need women to be in the home, barefoot, pregnant, having babies, producing Americans, essentially, and like maintaining that white Christian majority that we have, right? So basically, we go from in the 1920s and 1930s to it being illegal, but people letting it slide, to all of a sudden in the 1940s and 50s, doctors being severely prosecuted for performing abortions, which, you know, does not at all mean that abortion stopped. It's just that the practice now went underground and into way less skilled hands, which means that maternal mortality as a result of unsafe abortion significantly rose.
You know what this has me thinking about? You know, our whole Women in America slogan, damned if we do, damned if we don't. So you're telling me that during the war, that women were now being encouraged to have babies or forced to have babies. At the same time, wasn't World War II when women essentially entered the workforce en masse because they needed people at home to continue to pick up the work that the men who had left for the war left behind? And so we're put in this impossible spot where we need to go out and work because we are now primary breadwinners for the family while the men are off at war. But we also need to have all the babies.
Yeah.
How does that work? Like, what?
Yeah. And so it is honestly interesting when you look back at the history because you're just like, oh, wait, I can see all of these moments that were like critical for how women are now expected to balance both. You'd think that obviously more opportunities for women is what we're aiming for, but like the war example is a good one to explain. Like, it's not that women stopped being responsible for what was happening on the home front. We just also had to now assume additional responsibility for what was also happening on the work front.
So we were like doing all of our homemaking, taking care of the kids we already had, and then we were having to go be secretaries and do other things to like help subsidize the workforce that was gone, and then we had to continue having babies.
Yeah, and during all that time, abortions are illegal, even though that is a core part of our reproductive health care. So during that time, I think the Guttmacher Institute actually says that there were more than 1 million illegal abortions were performed every year in the US during the 1960s.
That is crazy.
Because it's not like the need for an abortion ever goes away, right?
And it's a key, having an abortion is a key component to pregnancy care, which sounds ironic, but as we know, if anything goes wrong in pregnancy, a lot of times the treatment is what we would call an abortion. Yeah. So like anytime a woman gets pregnant, there could be a medically necessary abortion.
Yeah, you can't have safe pregnancy options without having abortion. And childbirth is way more dangerous than abortion is. That's just simply a fact. I think also so during this time in 1965, 17% of deaths that were attributed to pregnancy were associated with illegal abortion. So that's the problem, is that because so much of it was driven underground, it was not being done by actual skilled professionals. And so a lot of the maternal mortality rate as a result of unsafe abortions skyrocketed during this time. Women need this care regardless of whether it's actually legal or offered. And we have seen that not just in the US, but in every single country throughout history.
You just brought us from like the beginning of America up till the mid 1900s. You have not once brought up religion, faith. So
it's coming.
Yeah. Okay. So take us to the point where it comes, because I have to say on that.
I wish it wasn't, but it is coming.
But I want to note for people that is very intentionally not a part of the narrative so far, because it was not a part of the narrative.
Yeah. So we've seen how so far it was like the advent of the American Medical Association that started this. Then the Great Depression sort of changed things. Then World War II changed things. And then the next thing that happened that took us into a change was, believe it or not, a rubella outbreak. Okay, so in the mid 1960s, there was a massive rubella outbreak globally, but especially affecting Americans. And rubella is an infectious disease that causes severe birth defects. And so that essentially moved the dial back. So abortion is illegal across the country, but now there's this infectious disease that is ravaging the country that is causing serious birth defects if you caught it during pregnancy. So medical authorities in the US all of a sudden endorsed what they called therapeutic abortions, okay? Which at the time they were considered exceptions to the law because they were safe, they were legal, they were happening by doctors, but just like today's world, you could only access them if you were privileged enough to be able to pay for a therapeutic abortion at a legitimate hospital, and also get to a hospital during a time where there was an infectious disease that was making its way through the country.
Were these quote unquote therapeutic abortions, and I say that because that's not a term that we use today, were those considered medically necessary, or are those the equivalent to what would be, I hate this term and I'll explain why in a later episode, but an elective abortion?
So they did not, ironically back then, they didn't actually feel the need to separate a distinction.
Cool.
They basically were just like, oh, this is a scenario in which, and I'm using quotation marks, this is justified because there's reason for it. And so they didn't care if it was elective or whatnot. They were just like, there is a context, because we all exist in the context.
Amazing reference.
Yeah, there's a context that allows this to be okay. And so because of that allowance of therapeutic abortions, women now who were privileged enough started to bring their cases to court, because they were like, hey, if I'm allowed to have it because of this, then why can't you allow me to have it in other situations? And so basically there were a few court cases that were fighting for access to hospital abortions. And then physicians started to agree with women, saying that not just rubella, but why not also other physical ailments, and why not other mental health ailments should be considered enough of a reason for a woman to be able to access this. And so basically there were like, it was court case after court case after court case, and it set off a wave of abortion reform bills in state legislatures. And that helped set the stage for what we now know to be the most landmark case in abortion, Roe v. Wade.
So let's pause there for a second because I want to just kind of highlight the two things that came out of the last segment. I'm hearing that this concept of medically necessary versus elective abortion, you're talking about the 60s now, and it still doesn't exist. That is a construct that we have made up in the very recent history of abortion.
Yeah. And I think the reason for that is probably tied to what you brought up earlier, which is like these religious undertones of like trying to determine what makes something okay and what doesn't. But yeah, that did not exist previously. Like it was, I mean, we saw it, even like abortion was illegal during the Great Depression, but it was being performed, openly performed in 11 states because they were just like, well, again, context. So,
the second piece I think that's important to highlight is that while there might have been like standalone, more local cases, abortion as a health issue, as a medical procedure, as something that women need, didn't enter the chat as like a court issue until
the 60s. Yeah.
Also, like, I mean, I wouldn't call the 60s recent history now, but fairly recent in the history of America.
Well, okay. I'll say reform started in the 60s when the AMA launched that letter writing campaign to the states. The states all criminalized abortion in the 1800s. So it was made illegal in the mid 19th century. And then in the 60s is when it really started, like the reform started.
Legal by legislation, though, not through...
Well, federal legislation, for example. So the 1800s was state legislation that made it illegal. Yeah. But also then the rubella outbreak I was just referencing happened in the mid 60s. I think it was 1963 to 65. So from then to when Roe was decided, which was 1973, so about 10 years, give or take, legal abortions were already available in 17 states, which means that states had individually changed their laws to match what was now turning into like a national movement. And so then it was those multiple state court cases that set the stage for Roe to happen in 1973. The important thing to note is that those 17 states in which it was legal and available, it was not just to save a woman's life. There were multiple allowances and multiple situations in which an abortion was considered justified and available. And that takes us all the way to Roe, which of course, was the first time that abortion was raised to the federal level, which you would think is a good thing, right? And it was. I mean, it protected the right. But raising the issue to the level of the Supreme Court and bringing up this concept of enshrining abortion rights for all Americans also galvanized opposition to it, as does everything. Like, that's just how it goes. But I think what people don't understand is that even from the moment it was decided, Roe was under attack virtually every single day. It mobilized anti-abortion groups. It caused a massive shift in things. And that is entirely because of
rising Christian nationalism.
Yeah.
Okay, so you've gotten us up to Roe. I want people to look at this conversation as a pendulum swinging, because that's kind of what it's turned into. Not necessarily up until this point, but in covering Roe, we swing to protections. And then once we get to today, the pendulum kind of swings back. The history of abortion rights in the US, specifically in the court system, has been this pendulum between access and restriction that was driven by, you were talking about, doctors' movements, social movements, public health movements of the rubella outbreak. But around the 70s and 80s, and now to today, is increasingly driven by legal interpretations and the evolving rise of Christian nationalism. So let's just quickly set the stage with Roe. Before Roe, which was the Supreme Court decision in 1973, abortion was largely criminalized across the US, with like 30 states saying that it was illegal and a couple that were offering exceptions in limited circumstances. And Roe was the court case that established the constitutional right to abortion under the 14th Amendment of the Constitution by balancing persons' right to privacy in their own doctor's office with these weird interests of states to define when the point of fetal viability was, which was driving a lot of the state restrictions at the time. I think another interesting thing about the Roe decision, I mean, people know that it was the landmark case that protected a constitutional right to abortion. A lot of people know that it was crafted around this privacy precedent. What I don't think a lot of people know is that it also set up today's pregnancy trimester system, because it set up this system of what the court defined as reasonable for women to have the right to abortion. So free right to abortion anywhere in what they were calling the first trimester. States could kind of start regulating abortion in the second trimester, depending on mother's health. And then by third trimester, states had much more leniency to restrict it. And so this is another tangent I'll save for another day, but a lot of repro rights advocates say that the Roe case was really the floor for repro rights because it shrouded abortion in this privacy argument. It created this false trimester system that you can notice because most doctors today talk about pregnancy in terms of like weeks, gestational weeks, not this weird trimester framework. So that's another story for another day. So the background of this Roe case was increasing pressure from evangelical Christians that was rising during the 70s and the 80s. And before then, you can kind of tell from what you were saying that we didn't really bring up Christianity at all. It wasn't even really a partisan issue. Like a lot of the earliest abortion rights activists and advocates actually came from Republican circles. And a lot of the opposition was rooted in not even Christian evangelical tenets, but like Catholic doctrine. And so the rise of Christian nationalism in the 80s became like a key mobilizing issue for the Republican Party. It was absolutely a shift in strategy. So Republican strategists were looking for new ways to galvanize white evangelical votes because they were growing politically active kind of in the aftermath, I will say, from their perspective of school integration. And there was this large white segment of the population that were feeling like they lost on the desegregation mandates in school. So after the Brown versus Board of Education decision, which made it illegal to segregate schools, huge evangelical figures like Jerry Falwell were rising in the Christian movement. And they were reframing this cultural fight on abortion and other social justice issues around morality and made abortion the central focus because they needed something for white Christians to cling on to at a time when Republicans were essentially losing public favor. This was originally, at that time, really a Southern strategy. They were trying to court conservative white voters in the wake of the civil rights movement. And they wanted this to really cement abortion as part of the Republican platform because the way that they were approaching this around morality aligned the opposition of abortion with broader themes of state rights and what we now hear all the time of these, I'm using quotes, traditional family values. So by the time that Ronald Reagan was president through most of the 80s, the Republican Party had fully adopted this pro-life stance, and we're using abortion as a wedge issue to unite the factions of conservatives that had separated after school integration, and were able to kind of bridge the gap between evangelicals and suburban voters. So this transition will not only reshape political alignments, but it also was really effective in ensuring, even still today, as we see from the election that just happened, that it is a divisive and polarizing issue in the US in politics. And it was a very strategic move by evangelical Christians joining with the Republican Party that is now intertwined with broader cultural and racial dynamics that we are not going to see the end of for years to come.
I want us to pause here and take note of the weight of how much the contentious pieces of our abortion history are actually just tied to white people not being okay with what folks, either women or people of color, are doing. The advent of the anti-abortion movement was exactly that. It was a group of white men who had issues with the fact that women were successfully running an entire industry, and they didn't like that. And then the advent of Christian nationalism adopting abortion as like their flagship moral contention issue was the fact that they didn't like that Black and brown people were now being afforded access to spaces that had historically been just white. And anyone who does not understand that race is a huge part of not just abortion dynamics, but so many other equality and equity issues in the US is truly blind, because that is something that continues to be a feature of every situation where there's a power dynamic, whether it's with the church, whether it's with the Republican Party, whether it's with folks who are currently able to have financial resources that others don't have access to. For example, for the last few weeks, we've been seeing a lot of hate coming from the Republican Party towards DEI initiatives. And it's exactly the same concept. It's historically, we have had undertones and actually very obvious overtones of racism throughout everything that happens in our country, unfortunately. And abortion is completely not just intertwined, but like parallel to racist movements in the US.
And this is very well documented, but it's like looked at as historical now, so we don't bring it up enough, honestly. But I think it's so important because it shows people how fabricated the divisiveness that abortion is today is. It's like a social construct. We made it that way.
Yeah.
White Christian men made it that way. It's not innately controversial by medical standards, even by social standards, which is why today you see so much of the American public agreeing with the fact that women should be able to access abortion in some, if not all, circumstances. They are being told to feel a certain way about abortion that's against your natural gut reaction to it because it's made up.
Yeah. Yeah. And the fact that the civil rights movement was tied to the anti-abortion movement, it shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody. And also, oftentimes, the MAGA crowd loves to talk about how the abortion movement is specifically targeting Black and brown women simply because they are accessing abortions. And it's like, no. There's like an entire racial justice and socioeconomic status that you're just completely ignoring as part of this conversation, which is convenient for you to do because you ignore it when it works for you and you embrace it when it does. But yeah, Christian nationalism was also probably the core reason why I said that Roe was under attack from the moment it was decided, is that even though it was the landmark case for abortion access in the US, it was never safe. It happened in the 73. And then in 92, through Christian nationalism and through all of the issues that had arisen in the South because of the civil rights movement, there was enough contention to now have another landmark case, which is called Planned Parenthood versus Casey. And this was in 1992. And at the time, it posed the most significant existential threat to the protections that had been afforded by Roe.
And why is that?
So the ultimate decision in Planned Parenthood v. Casey upheld Roe, but it essentially created the environment that we are experiencing today because it gave states far greater scope than ever before to regulate abortion on their own. So a lot of experts actually refer to the 1992 Supreme Court case as the case that launched 1,000 abortion regulations, because even though it maintained the federal right, it essentially created this like huge conversation and debate around this concept of viability, which previously had not been something that people had thought about as a concept. Exactly what you were saying, Eve, is that so much of what is used as contention points are just completely fabricated.
I mean, there were some arguments in, I think, the early 1900s about the point of the quickening.
Yeah.
which was meant to represent what we now call fetal viability. But like, this was not a large part of the conversation around abortion rights
Yeah.
until Planned Parenthood v. Casey.
And the reason for that is because up until 2022, the people carrying the pregnancy were considered persons, not the fetus itself, right? So this concept of personhood was only being applied to the women themselves. And personhood has still not come into this, but what the early remnants of personhood were quickening or viability or whatever it is. And the 1992 Casey case essentially opened up this huge can of worms around this concept of viability, which was, of course, further complicated by the fact that we're now in the 90s and we are experiencing medical advancements that did not exist for the centuries before this, which means that those advancements we're seeing that viability was happening earlier and earlier. And so that gave huge wind to like the pro-life movement, and the Christian nationalists really went in on the idea of like viability and heartbeat and so on. And so, yeah, so Casey at the time was like, people were very concerned about it because they were, they thought it would undo things. But essentially what it did is it upheld the federal right, but then also allowed states to put in a whole bunch of their own restrictions, which today are referred to as TRAP laws, right? Which is Targeted Regulation of Abortion Providers, TRAP, TRAP laws.
Those are the crazy laws that say that clinics need to have hallways big enough to fit a hospital gurney, even though there's no medical reason to put someone who needs an abortion on a hospital gurney by any means. They can walk themselves, but yet it forces these clinics to spend $1 million renovating their freaking hallways for absolutely no reason.
Yeah. And some other examples include the 48-hour waiting period, the requirement that you have to see the same physician twice. Like there's multiple things like that. Even just requiring physicians to have admitting privileges at local hospitals, even though there's no reason for them to do that. So there's over 25 TRAP laws, and different states have adopted different ones. But the reason why those exist is because Casey made it possible for those.
Whose job do you think it is to just sit around and think up TRAP laws? Is they're that ridiculous that I'm like, did people just go on like a bender, like just have a lot of drinks and we're like, I got a ridiculous one for you, Chad. Why don't we try this in legislation? Let's go.
So I know you're joking about that, but I genuinely think I'm thinking about Mississippi, for example, right? Where prior to what happened in 2022, there was only one clinic that was standing in the entire state, which is insane because Mississippi has, I need to Google the population of Mississippi, but it's got to be at least like over 2 million people of reproductive age. And they had one clinic for the entire state. And then the reason why I'm bringing them up is because that rule about the hallway size for the hospital gurneys was specifically targeting that clinic. Like the state legislature for Mississippi came up with that law after getting people to go inside the clinic and figure out like what they could possibly do to get this place shut down. And that place, they managed to raise enough money to do the renos. They did not, however, continue to survive the new legislations that are now existing. But like you're saying, like, oh, they went to a bar, got drunk, and like came up with this stuff. I actually think they did. Like legitimately, like in the states where they were like targeting individual clinics, they definitely did that shit. They put people undercover, went inside, and we're like, what are the most random things we can come up with? Yeah. So then like basically from after Casey, we had all of these TRAP laws and state laws come into play with obviously mostly the conservative states. And then in 2022 was when shit really went down.
But before 2022, states were also putting in place trigger laws.
Yes, absolutely. I think you should explain what those are.
So the trigger laws were like states were drafting legislation for the day that they had all dreamt of when Roe would fall. And basically writing what their state bans would be so that as soon as the Supreme Court would hear a case on Roe, if Roe was overturned, those trigger laws would immediately go into effect.
Yeah.
And I'd have to go back and confirm the number, but I feel like when the Dobbs decision came down and Roe was overturned, because of these trigger laws, there were 13 states
that immediately
that immediately restricted abortion because they already had this legislation in place. So, like, just to say that what reproductive rights advocates have been saying for years, like, it did not surprise us when Roe was overturned. We saw it coming. Conservatives and evangelicals had been working at this for years and years and years and decades. It was not if, it was when.
Yeah.
So much so that legislators were literally writing laws for this day whenever it came.
Yeah, and I know I've said this a few times, but that's exactly what I mean by the fact that Roe was under attack from the moment it was decided.
Yep.
And so I skipped to 2022, but the truth is I should have paused at 2016 because that is when the environment that has made everything possible today happened, right? So Trump won his first election in 2016. And when that happened, he obviously, okay, I'm going to say this. Historically, Trump is pro-choice. Like, he used to be a Democrat. He was the biggest funder of the Trump campaign. And I would bet a lot of my money that he has paid for abortions himself. But essentially was saying what he needed to say in order to get his voter base riled up. It worked. He won. And then
he followed the Republican talking points and the conservative talking points that they put in place in the 80s.
Right. And set into place a series of events because he appointed the Supreme Court judges. So when Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett were going through their confirmation hearings for SCOTUS, they lied under oath during their confirmation hearings when they were asked if they would touch Roe. Both of them said absolutely not. And of course they did. And so what Eve was mentioning with the trigger laws is that so many states had trigger laws in place, but the reason why they did is because they knew as of 2016 that it was a matter of time. So not only did reproductive rights advocates know that this was coming, but state legislatures knew that this was coming, and they had intended on that happening when they had appointed Trump the first time. So in 2022, when Trump's Supreme Court undid Roe, it, exactly as you said, triggered bans across several states, but even within states that didn't have trigger laws in place, within a few months, they had written legislation that had either imposed severe gestational limits on their access to abortion or banned it outright. And then, since then, we've had some states go take it even further and go beyond abortion, which anyone in the industry will tell you was their exact goal the entire time. It's just that they centered abortion because they had spent so many decades making sure that the public was all of a sudden not okay with this issue that they had previously been, right? But now in Oklahoma, for example, in Idaho, for example, we are seeing state laws being written that are attacking contraceptive access, that are attacking IVF access. And so abortion was really just the first step in a long, intentional journey of theirs to come after reproductive health as a whole, because it has never, ever been about the sanctity of life and entirely always been about the control of women.
I think the American public vastly underestimates the long game that conservatives have been playing and are playing. They have the degradation of women's rights in the US strategized over the next like three to 5 decades.
Yeah, such a good point. Like, I'm going to use a Drake reference, but like, they didn't take us from 0 to 100. Like, they didn't go straight from like in the 1800s being like, hey, we are going from a situation where abortion is totally legal and totally practiced to a situation in which women are no longer allowed to work. That's just it. But that's what they've done. That what they're doing right now is like, they're taking us from 0 to 10, from 10 to 20. Like, they started with abortion access. Then they started talking about pregnancy registers. Then they're talking about coming after contraceptives. Then they're coming after IVF. Like, they're getting rid of protections for pregnant workers in the workplace. They are getting rid of disability protections. They are making sure that the pay gap is not being addressed. Like, I just mentioned like things that could be like an entire season of a podcast as opposed to one episode, but my point is simply that like it's intentional, a systematic chipping away of reproductive rights because they want to normalize people to this idea. If you take someone and suggest to them on day one that women are not equal human beings, that person is going to think you're crazy.
Mm-hmm.
But if you put them through months and months and months of propaganda and normalize them to every idea, then all of a sudden, things that they previously would have thought were batshit crazy are now actually like not that bad.
On a more lighthearted note, before we close out talking about the current patchwork of abortion access in America, part of the reason we stay friends from my end is because you keep me on my toes. If you had asked me at the beginning of this episode, is Pari going to drop a Drake reference and connect it to abortion rights in America, I would have said no. And yet you have done just that.
Yeah, well, he's probably not the best person to be talking about right now, but that lyric is still valid.
So valid. So valid. Okay, so that brings us
to where we're at now, basically.
Where we are at now on the kind of judicial front. And also, we talked about in our first episode our raison d'etre for our social media accounts. So enter us in 2022. But now, 2 to 3 years into the Dobbs decision, we have what a lot of people call this legal patchwork, or I've also seen it called, it sounds like an old Western movie, like A Tale of Two Americas.
Yeah. And actually, just to clarify, when Eve says the Dobbs decision, she's referring to the 2022 case that undid Roe. We always refer to it as Roe because that's what people recognize, but the actual name of the case is Dobbs. So that's the one that undid it all.
And so the two Americas, or this patchwork concept, comes from the idea that there's protective states that are mostly blue, and then there's restrictive states that are mostly red. So states like California or New York have strengthened or constitutionalized in the last election that we had in November access to abortion and increased funding for abortion services. I think there was 10 abortion related ballots at the last election and 7 of them passed. So those are the types of protective states that we're talking about, which offer like sanctuaries for care and access for out-of-state patients that come from the other side of things, like Texas, like Alabama, that have near total abortion bans, that are criminalizing providers, that are passing bounty hunter laws that say that people can make citizens arrest for aiding and abetting abortions.
Yeah, it's madness.
Those are like my favorite t-shirts that say I will aid and abet abortion, because the concept of that is like so wild to me. And so this patchwork really creates a lot of confusion for patients and also for providers, who we saw in the cases that came out, one of the cases that came out of Georgia, like providers are now waiting to provide care to women in desperate need of abortion because they are so scared that they will get their medical license revoked for providing an abortion on a patient that is later then deemed not for medical necessity, that they just don't provide care. And that's where we get all of this language about women are bleeding out in parking lots. Like, it's not hyperbole, it's actually happening because doctors are so afraid. And we can't place that on the doctors. We can't place that on the doctors because they are abiding by the best that they know of is the, legal system within which they operate and that their careers depend on. So this patchwork system raises ethical concerns, logistical concerns about equity, about individuals traveling for care and others being left behind, depending on the color of your state or your zip code, as we often say.
And one of the things that we haven't yet got into, because, this episode we focused on the history, and I think there's going to be another episode on what we anticipate is coming. But it's worth noting also that as of January 21st, the entire context that we just discussed is now up for debate again, right? Because if a federal ban goes into effect, then there's no such thing as a difference between a blue and a red state anymore. Mm-hmm. So I think it would be worth us also talking about what we anticipate may come. But essentially, the point of this episode is that we wanted to point out that if you look at the history of abortion in the United States, we have seen periods of tolerance and acceptance followed by periods of severe repression. We happen to be in one of the periods of severe repression to an extent that has not existed before. What remains to be seen is whether it will last, and if so, for how long, and what comes after.
We hope today's discussion shed light on just how precarious reproductive rights are in America today and how deeply rooted they are in systems of control. Join us next week as we explore how access to abortion intersects with race, class, and healthcare inequality. And remember, as we face a landscape shaped by Dobbs, the right for reproductive rights is more urgent than ever because standing still is not an option, and every action we take today shapes the future we leave behind. See you next time.